at me pointedly before emitting a soft chuckle and resuming his position. My fidgeting fingers went to my hoodie sleeves. "You saw that, huh?" I grimaced as my cheeks burned with embarrassment that he had seen Edward's pornographic magazines in the wastebasket. Rosalie simply rolled her eyes as she began packing away baseball paraphernalia.
"See, Bella, there are certain rules when living in a man's space,"
he began with a serious tone, and I wrapped my arms around my torso as it throbbed and ached with the emptiness of knowing that I really didn't live in Edward's space. I just lived in the shadowy impression of it.
"Listen closely, Rosie babe,"
he added with a sideways glance in her direction. She ignored him as she packed another box and Emmett continued.
"Men hold specific things sacred. Porn. The remote control. The non-existence of tampons. Porn.
He accentuated with a glare at me and continued.
Alcoholic beverages. And for the love of God, Bella."
He trailed off and straightened from his crouch with a firm stare.
"Never ever fuck with a man's porn,"
he finished disapprovingly. I rolled my eyes but nodded so he wouldn't continue explaining his rules. "So, do you need help, or what?" I mumbled shortly while hugging my arms tightly around myself. Emmett furrowed his brows and tilted his head, likely because he was expecting a laugh, but I was in no mood to accommodate that. He nodded, and shrugged one shoulder.
"Sure,"
he answered softly while pointing to his desk. I spent the next 30 minutes in silence packing away his books and papers into a box. With every new thing that left his desk, or floor, or drawers, I couldn't help feeling as though this was too much. After so long, I turned around and decided to tell him so. "What about Carlisle?" I asked with a thick voice. Emmett met my gaze with a confused expression while Rose kept taking his things and shoving them in 2 boxes. My fists clenched at my sides. "You're leaving him," I hissed with narrowed eyes. Logically, I knew that Emmett had to leave for college, but I couldn't stop the anger that swelled in me that someone else was abandoning Carlisle. Slowly, he rose from his crouch and shook his head.
"I have to go, you know. Carlisle will be fine, and plus, we're staying close."
He attempted to reassure me, but something in his words only made my anger grow further. I jutted my chin and glared at him defiantly as I allowed my fury to control my body and words. "Is that what you thought when you told Edward to leave? Because you were obviously wrong." I could almost see my hard words hit him as he flinched visibly and paled under my glare. He began shaking his head once more, and Rose had finally ceased her task to gape at me in blatant incredulity. I had never spoken like this around her and had certainly never made it clear that I was looking to place blame for Edward's departure on her boyfriend.
"I never told him to leave,"
Emmett whispered, but the minute touch of remorse that laced his tone betrayed his guilt. "No, you didn't say the exact words, but you're the one who suggested it. You're the reason he left," I spat at him resentfully. The little alarm in my head was beginning to sound, reminding me that I was trying to argue with a man 3 times my size that could probably kill me with one hand before I had the chance to run. This was the state of mind in which I anxiously fled the room and returned to Edward's. That evening, Rose came to my room with a hard pound on my door. Before I even attempted to open it, it flew open, and she stomped inside, slamming the door behind her. "Who the hell do you think you are?" she demanded in a scathing voice that made my stomach lurch. I sat dumbfounded on the bed as she moved closer and scowled at me. "You childish little of all the people, how dare you!" she screeched, her pale skin turning a curious shade of red. I swallowed, having never been privy to the sight of Rose's anger before. She began pacing the carpet while sneering at me. "Do you have any idea how guilty he's felt for this whole thing, and then you have to come along and be ridiculous enough to encourage it?" She halted in front of the bed, seething and downright beautiful in her fury as the platinum blonde of her hair accentuated the red in her puffing cheeks. "If you don't take it all back before we leave tomorrow, so help me, Belle, I will never forgive you for ruining what's meant to be a new beginning for us," she promised as her chest heaved and her sharp, blue eyes cut into mine. Tears stung at my eyes, and I nodded without speaking, afraid that my voice would betray my fear of losing her friendship, and the shame I felt for treating Emmett so callously. Her face softened infinitesimally as a traitorous tear slipped from my eye and I swatted it away. "I'm not trying to be a bitch," she sneered with residual anger. There was a pause, and then a maniacal chuckle escaped me with wide eyes. I clamped a hand over my mouth, bracing for her anger once again for laughing at the contrast of her words and tone. Instead she rolled her eyes, a smile flirting at the corner of her lips, as she flopped onto the bed. "Sorry," she mumbled, allowing herself one chuckle and a shake of her head. "I don't like it when people fuck with my man," she explained with a shrug. I smiled, and apologized in a quiet voice that she accepted before embracing me in a firm hug. Tears stung at my eyes once more at the meaning of this embrace. It was goodbye. "I'm only a phone call away," she whispered into my hair, as her arms pressed me tightly against her. I nodded into her shoulder, and released her with a forced smile. That night, I wrote Emmett a letter and slipped it under his door. Partly because I was too ashamed to face him in person, and partly because I didn't want to say another goodbye. A small part of me did blame him, just like a small part of me blamed me. Though I couldn't let it go, I did accept the fact that it was never their intention to drive him away. Dr. Carmen stared at me for a really long time after I told her about that night 2 weeks ago. She kept her legs crossed, and the pen lingering idly over her notepad. Her brown eyes bore into me with a neutral expression as she sat motionless. It made me uncomfortable, and I had this urge to keep talking, even though the memory ended there. I scratched my eyebrow and crossed my ankles, leaning to one side of the chair before shifting my position. "Why are you here?" she asked after 5 minutes of charged silence. Her expression hadn't changed any, but the tone of her voice seemed controlled and decisive. I bit my lip for a moment, and my leg began to bounce anxiously. "I want to get inside of the closet," I answered truthfully with a tone that matched hers. She shook her head slowly, and I noted that it was the only time I had spoken in which she didn't begin writing. "No, I want you to tell me about the exact moment you decided to come. Don't leave out any impressions or thoughts," she requested. Though I was annoyed by her resistance to my explanation, I did as she asked, and recalled the conversation between Carlisle and me 3 nights prior. It was a Wednesday, and I was going to procure the credit card statements from my place on the sofa, but I was having another bad day. Rose and Emmett had just left, and Alice and Jasper were out camping a last hurrah without parental observation before school resumed. I shuddered to think what they were up to. Without much to keep me occupied, I spent my hours watching the closet door, and wishing that I had the ability to overcome my fear. The circle was tiresome and I'd grown weary with attempting to open it, so I had to settle for staring at it. I was more than happy to be in someone else's presence for a while, hoping that Carlisle's conversation could distract me and make me feel normal for a little while. When I reached the study, he was behind his desk as usual and gave me the time I needed to enter. The large envelope was sitting on the brown leather sofa, as it always was, and I pushed it aside before sitting in my perfunctory knee-hugging pose. Truthfully, I was always impatient to read the contents of the envelope. It was the only glimpse into Edward that I had anymore. I'd spend days dissecting the purchases he made and imagine what he was doing with them. It was downright pitiful, but it gave me something to look forward to. But I still craved the company of another, so I saved the ritual of obsession for after my time with Carlisle. "Good evening," I managed to say without wavering in a quiet voice as Carlisle watched me from behind his desk. He sank further into his seat, a familiarly relieved smile on his lips, as he returned my greeting.
"Are you excited for school to begin again?"
he asked casually, resting his temple on his fist and gazing at me with fond eyes. I scoffed and picked at the frayed hem of my jeans. "Elated," I replied dryly, eliciting a chuckle from Carlisle as I rested my cheek on mine. His chuckle ceased, and his eyes became scrutinizing.
You look very tired.
he sighed, appearing disappointed in my lack of sleep. I merely shrugged and drew my bottom lip between my teeth in avoidance. I slept when it was absolutely necessary. He brought his idle hand to his forehead and began rubbing it soothingly.
It's almost disturbing how similar you two are.
He whispered, brief gleams of both comfort and regret flashing in his eyes before he was once again neutral. I knew what he meant, but his comment startled me so completely that I was reduced to gaping dumbly at his face. I'm not like Edward, I insisted, feeling momentarily enraged at his suggestion. For some reason it had offended me to be seen that way. I knew how people saw Edward, how he treated others. I was shy and solitary, but I wasn't callous and harsh to others. I had bad dreams that kept me awake, but I didn't smoke or do drugs to escape them. I liked to be alone inside of his room, but I didn't spend my time clinging to the past by drawing and wallowing in my misery. Right. Carlyle's gaze turned apologetic, but instead of rescinding his insinuation, he elaborated.
Not entirely, but in many ways you are comparable. You both have mutual habits of avoiding sleep, but that much is obvious. You'd both rather be alone than in the company of others. You both have an obsession with remaining independent of any assistance whatsoever. Some days, when I hear you up in that room, it's almost like he never left.
He mumbled, shifting his gaze throughout the room thoughtfully. I narrowed my eyes until his eyes met mine. You're comparing all the wrong things. I'm not mean to people, and I don't get into trouble, I argued firmly, and he quirked an eyebrow at me.
Not yet,
he murmured, and I recoiled incredulously as I continued gaping. What on earth would make anyone think I'd ever turn to that kind of behavior, I wondered. Sensing my offended confusion, he continued with calculating eyes.
Just observationally speaking, you become more like him every day. It hasn't escaped anyone's notice that you've completely stopped cooking, which used to be your favorite thing to do. It's like you're shrinking to fit his shoes.
He mused softly, pursing his lips in thought. His summation was like an arrow through my already pained chest. What if I was turning into Edward? What if I became that same impervious soul that hurt everyone around me with denial and my own internal bitterness? What if I became the very evil I loathed most about the person I loved? What if I was already too far gone to be anything more than a girl who stares at a closet door all day and imagines an entirely different setup? What ifs? Fuck that. I was better than Edward. I was more, and I was honest, and when I made a promise, I was sure to keep it. And that was really the nail in the coffin. Promises. They were meant to be kept and sealed with the trust between the two people involved. Edward had lost mine. It was only fair to return the favor. I blinked back the burning tears of revelation, and lifted my chin. I untucked my knees from my chest, and planted my feet firmly on the floor. Carlyle was regarding me warily as my posture grew defiant and decisive. What if I did want help? I asked in a surprisingly still voice. Carlyle's brow furrowed in confusion, so I added the words that would keep me restless and anxious for days to come. What if I wanted therapy? His creased brow slowly smoothed, and I think his lips momentarily parted in astonishment. The sudden flash of unbridled excitement and elation in his eyes overwhelmed me before he visibly reined in his reaction.
I suppose that would make you very unlike Edward,
he confirmed, straightening in his seat to rest his hands atop his desk. I could tell he was trying very hard to keep his expression carefully indifferent, and failing rather miserably. I wondered why this excited him so much. Okay, I said, suspiciously, having already made up my mind. So what do you suggest? I smiled, watching as understanding dawned across his face, and his eyes widened.
he
stammered, as the overwhelming enthusiasm once again flashed in his eyes. His hand went to a Rolodex on his desk, and began flipping through it hastily while he spoke in a frenzied tone.
Well, I have a few colleagues that focus on the specifics of your condition. I've spoken to them before, and they all have different methods of practice. I think you could probably benefit from a veteran of the field. Considering your past experiences, someone firm, yet maybe a little unorthodox to keep you interested. The woman, of course. There are a few people in the area who focus on various techniques.